Hey, today's lecture is about questioning. And questioning is one of the key traits that make up the innovator's DNA. I'm going to give you the short version about the study behind the innovator's DNA because your reading for this week goes in on it in much more depth. And I don't want to make you listen to something you've already read about or you're going to read about. So, the short version is that researchers at Harvard University got curious. What's the difference between leaders of companies that innovate and leaders of companies that just stagnate? They tried to find the answer by making pairs of companies. They took one company that was innovative and found another company in the same industry and with as many other qualities in common, like size and age and whether it's publicly owned. And they paired them into comparison companies. And then they looked at the leaders of those companies and profiled those leaders in many ways. They tried to figure out, what do the leaders of innovative companies have in common that the leaders of, just going along, maybe doing good work, but not covering new ground, companies are lacking? They found that innovative leaders aren't especially demanding like Steve Jobs necessarily, or they're not super lenient. They're not necessarily wacky. They're not necessarily rigid. What they do have in common is that they're unusually good at observing, questioning, experimenting, associating, and or networking. So we're going to take each of those topics in more detail over this and the following 4 lectures so that you can get a real exposure to each element of the innovator's DNA. You might be sitting here thinking, how am I going to get good at all of that? The good news is you don't have to. The innovative leaders they found aren't necessarily top-notch at all of them. Hopefully they don't have any real deficits in any of these areas. You don't want to be super worse than average. But if you have 1 or 2 or 3 of these traits that you super develop, you've got a much better chance of being a leader of an innovative team or company. This week, we're going to look at questioning. Questions open the door to a different future. Leaders who use questioning to make their companies innovative aren't satisfied with the ways that things are right now. They always want to understand why we do it that way. What other ways could we try? Who are we really serving, and are we missing people who might be great customers? What do our customers really need that we may not have even noticed yet? They ask those questions, and they're also really great at keeping their ears open for questions that are being asked by others. An example of that comes from the story of Edwin Land. He's the founder of Polaroid. He was on vacation with his 3-year-old daughter, and she asked, "Why can't I see my pictures right away? Why do I have to wait to get them developed?" He heard that and he realized that he had an idea that could lead to a company that was very successful for decades and decades and decades. And he led it for decades and decades and decades. 75 years later, on another vacation, I guess vacations are important, Instagram got its start when one of their founders-to-be was at the beach and noticed that his wife was taking a lot of pictures but wasn't posting them. Maybe to Twitter or to Facebook, the platforms that were available at the time. And she said she just wasn't satisfied with how the pictures looked. They didn't look as good as she felt, or they didn't look as good as she wanted them to look for their friends to see them. And he did not dismiss her. He heard the question. His question, why aren't you posting pictures? And his wife's implicit question, which is, why can't my pictures be better? Why does it have to be difficult to fine-tune a photograph? And he realized that a photo sharing application that included filters would meet her need and probably the needs of many other people around the world. So those are two giant advances separated by decades in how we see and share photos, both of which were made possible by questioning. But don't get too excited just yet. Just because a sentence ends with a question mark doesn't mean it's necessarily a useful question. What do I mean by a useful question? A useful question for a company or a person that's going to innovate is a question that opens the door to new understandings and new ideas. So how about this? 5 + 5 = question mark. This stopped being a useful question somewhere in early elementary school when you learned the answer to it so automatically that you can probably see it without even thinking about it. Any question that has an automatic answer is a question that can be asked better or abandoned. That's because it's narrow. It's limiting. It's basically a question pretends, it gives this front that it is something that's going to take you someplace new. But sometimes questions like this are basically smuggling in an answer. Because the only thing you can say really is 10. And maybe if you're with your math friends, you could find a more complicated way to say 10. But, the answer is 10. This shows up in, this is, I admit, an extreme example. This is sort of not super applicable to, you're never going to be in a product development meeting where they come in and say, okay, 5 + 5, what is it? That's our challenge for today. But if you or someone on your team asks a question like, how am I going to carry my coffee from place to place so it doesn't spill and it stays warm? Or even we've got an answer for that. There's pretty much just one answer. You can get it in lots of colors and shapes and materials, but it's a travel mug. Maybe a thermos. Instead, you might ask a question like, how am I going to have a pick-me-up with me on a cold day? That could have a lot of different answers. That might take you to a product category that hasn't already been filled. So what I just did there is an example of reframing. Reframing a question isn't just dismissing it. So if I had said in that meeting, your question is dumb, or your question isn't good enough for us to brainstorm on, that would have been, being a bad teammate. That would have been an example of the kind of criticism that makes people hide away their answers. But if I had said something like, ooh, I think you're onto something, would it be okay for me to try reframing it so that we can get to a broader range of possibilities? Then you'd be onto something. And when you're reframing, first just check the quality of your question. Just do a quick check. Are we on the right track? You might be, you might not be. If your question only invites one kind of answer, it's time to rephrase it. Look at all of the assumptions buried in that question. Like, for example, the assumption that you're carrying coffee. What is the coffee for? Maybe it's for a pick-me-up. Maybe it's to stay warm. If you go back and say, how can I have a warm pick-me-up on a cold day? Then you've opened it up to more possibilities. The other thing I have to say is, even if your question is really broad and is a powerful question, once you've done some brainstorming, go ahead and reframe it anyway. Because a second reframing will open you up to even more possible answers. And at this stage, generating a broad range of answers will then give you what you need to be able to choose a few to take to testing, which will make you most likely to have one that will succeed at the end. So here's one for you. Here's a smuggler's question. Where should we take Joe for a birthday dinner? Do you hear that? Do you hear the assumptions in that? One is that Joe even wants to do anything for her birthday. So, hopefully you're good enough friends that you have checked that. But it also assumes that dinner is the thing to do. What if you asked something different? And these different kinds of questions I think of as being more like blank plus blank equals 10. That could be 5 plus 5, 4 plus 6. You could get fractions or percentages in there. You could have a negative number, like 20 plus negative 10 equals 10. There are lots of different combinations that could get you towards that answer. More of a like x plus x equals 10 question would be, how can we make Joe's birthday memorable? From that, you could find a lot of different kinds of solutions. Maybe you'll go to a hike. Maybe you'll go to a spa. Maybe you'll hire a singing telegram. Maybe you'll go bowling. All of these are assuming COVID appropriate alternatives. So you can see how you might even go for dinner. It's not excluded as an answer. It's just not the only answer. You can see how in this version, each new question opens up your ability to generate new ideas. Procter & Gamble faced a situation like this. They started with, how can we help consumers get floors and toilets clean? Well, that has a pretty narrow set of answers with tools and cleaning fluids. It's better than asking, what's our next version of scrubbing bubbles? I guess that's bathtubs, but you know what I mean. But it's still pretty limited. Instead, they tried asking, how can we give consumers their Saturday mornings back? That opens up a much wider range of possibilities. And I just want to point out that this is super useful for you as a student, because as a student, you are juggling a lot of different priorities, and you are being asked to come up with a lot of different solutions. Although those solutions might be things like, how am I going to structure this paper? How am I going to stay motivated to study this topic that is not my favorite? How am I going to be brave enough to talk in front of other people? Those are all things that get asked of you as a student that might require problem solving from you. And so as you're doing that, I want you to check on whether you're asking yourself the most open, generative question that you can. Like for the public speaking one, I actually kind of enjoy public speaking. That's ironically true for, I am an introvert, and there is this like giant subset of introverts who really can get energy out of going up in front of a room. Wait till we talk about networking. That's what I find difficult as an introvert. So thinking about when students are having to present in front of a class or even an even larger group takes me back to thinking about my undergraduate days and I took a class on Shakespeare, and we had to get into pairs and present a scene from one of the plays. We had to act out a scene that had 2 characters in it. And I could feel that I was getting sick. You know how you can feel it like in your throat? I could feel it coming. And so I got with my friend who was in the class with me, and we were doing the scene together. And I was like, okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to be in class that day. But I have an idea. And what we did was we did a scene from Hamlet where Hamlet is talking to a ghost. And I played the ghost, and I filmed my role in advance. And we had like an old, this was back in the day. And so we had an old TV and a VCR, and I was sick the day of class, but my friend brought in the TV and VCR and performed the scene with me on the screen, which worked because, we can make an argument that a ghost isn't really corporeally there. So being on screen is more ghost-like than if I'd been in the room. And that worked. Because we had done the thinking and we hadn't panicked. Panic tends to get us stuck with closed questions. Instead, we opened it up and found another way to do it. I also hope that that story gives you a cue to the level of creativity I'm looking for in your presentations that you're going to do for phase 1 and phase 3 of the design fiction. If I did that for just a regular class, I'm looking for you to go even farther. Okay. As you're thinking about reframing, I wanted to give you some particular approaches that can be really helpful. For example, asking, what else could this mean? Do you have to be in the room for a presentation? None of you are going to be in the room with me during your presentation, so maybe not. Where else could this be useful? Is there something I can learn from this? What's the funny side of this? Sometimes starting from the solution is a better way to get to reframing the problem. So if this had worked, what would I be doing now? Okay, how do I get to be doing that? Are there opportunities inside this problem? What does this look like to other people who are involved? And this one, I have to admit, this is one I use all the time. It's particularly one that I used before I started working at Mount Royal, because I would constantly being given creative challenges that I didn't always believe in. And sometimes I frankly thought they were dumb. And it's fine to spend a little bit of time thinking that way, but you really need to be able to move on from that. And it can be really hard to move on from that. And so one of the things I did was I just had my personal roster of creative heroes, and I would ask myself, okay, how would Kathy McLean make this exhibit? If Kathy McLean, or even if Kathy McLean had asked me to take on this project, what would I do then? Because I believe don't expect you to know who Kathy McLean is. She's super insider, science center, museum world person, but she's brilliant and exciting and bold. And I knew that if I could convince myself that Kathy McLean would have given me this assignment, then there must be gold in there somewhere. And I should be flexible and loose enough to come up with this. So here's another way you can go to it. I call this upside down and inside out. And basically, what it means is taking the assumptions that you're bringing to a topic, and instead of trying to like ignore them or repress them, instead you pay attention to them. So like the one for the birthday. What are some of the assumptions we're making if the question is, where will we take Jo for her birthday dinner? Well, like I said, there's an assumption that Jo wants her birthday celebrated. There's an assumption that dinner is the right thing to do. There's an assumption that her birthday is the time to do it. Like maybe she's one of those people who hates getting older and doesn't want to think about it and would rather just be taken out on a random Wednesday night. There's also, take Jo out for a birthday dinner. The idea that dinner's the thing to do. And I talked about that earlier. So by listing all of those things, almost treating it like a Mad Lib, you can tweak each one of them. You can say, okay, well, we promised Jo we'd do something for her birthday, but does it have to be dinner? Or even, we are assuming this would be going to a restaurant, but what if it's a picnic? Or what if it's like we hire a personal chef for a night to teach us how to make something at our home? There are so many ways to reconceptualize just by going in. Basically, every word in your sentence, see if you can change it. Instead of, if it's a noun, choose a different noun. If it's a verb, choose a different verb. If it's a preposition, try a different preposition. Not out to dinner. Maybe it's in for dinner. And that way you can generate a lot of different approaches without having to make even creative leaps at that stage. It can get a little mechanical, which sometimes is nice when you're swimming in everything that's going on in the creative process. So, how about a library? My assumptions about a library for a long time were that it was a place with books, that I could read the books there or borrow them, that you're not supposed to make noise, that they are, until very recently, there were a lot of rules about not having food or beverages. That's something that many libraries have changed, and that's helped them reinvigorate how they're welcoming people. And I also assume that libraries are free and open to the public, as long as you're following the rules, that you're allowed to be there and you don't have to pay to be there. That's a lot of assumptions, and we could test all of those to come up with new ideas. Like the idea that you check out a book. There are actually programs where you can check out a person. Not for 2 weeks, maybe for a couple of hours, but like people volunteer, people who think I'm from a community that I bet people wonder about or that I wish was better known, have volunteered to become check-outable. And you could say, hey, I've always wanted to know a person from Chile, and I can meet one at the library. Or I've always wanted to know about what it's like to work at the circus, and I can find that out by talking to someone, make time with them and go out for coffee or whatever. So like the idea of not being able to drink your coffee in the library, that's been pretty well tossed out. The idea that it's only books, that's been tossed out. You can get movies, music, lots of other things from libraries. Some even have toys or tools that you can borrow. Calgary has a tool library if you're ever doing a project where you need tools that you don't own. That's a way to get them, to borrow them, and not having to buy them and then store them forever. There are also even libraries that the public is not invited to. There is, I love this story, there is a library for magicians in New York City. And that you have to belong to like the Magicians Guild to be able to go in, and it has lots of information about how classic tricks were done. I learned about this library from a profile of Jay-Z, and this is why I love this story, because one of the things Jay-Z has done with his stacks and stacks and stacks of money is buy new bookshelves for the Magicians Library, and I think that's amazing. So, okay, lots of different ways you can look at a library. Do the same thing. I would just challenge you to take a few minutes, pause me, make me stop talking at you, and think about how restaurants could be different. Think about all your assumptions and reverse them. And just see if that can lead you to something that might be a business or service that you wish existed. Things like food trucks benefit from this kind of reframing. There are all kinds of businesses that could exist but don't yet because someone hasn't asked this kind of question. And of course, this is going to be extremely useful and important for your design fiction project. So use this when you get stuck in your design fiction project. Ask yourself, is there a more generative question we could be asking? And finally, keep using questions when you're in conversations with people. It's good for networking, we'll get to that eventually, but it's also really good to be able to open up your ability to have new ideas. So if you ask, hey, I noticed your cuff is rolled up every day when you come into work. What's that about? You might find out that someone's a cyclist, which could open you up to a whole world of information. Or ask, oh, hey, I heard that you spent a year in Egypt. Can you tell me about that? I'm super curious. What was a typical day like? What was an unusual day that you remember? There are so many doors that are just, the key is a question. That's all it takes for you to get the inspiration and the ideas that are just sitting waiting for you around in your world. So please hone your ability to work with questions. Hone your ability to turn a mediocre question into a great question. You will only benefit from it. If you have any questions for me, you know how to email me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks.